Yeah.
Let me see if I can figure that out.
Are you in your pajamas and you don't want us to see you?
I wish I was in my pajamas.
I know.
That'd be great. Let me see here. Well, now I'm red, huh?
Yes, now you're in.
Huh. All right, let's try this. Huh. All right, I'm going to try. Oh, there we go. Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Right? Okay, good. You can see me because I can see you.
Nice meeting you.
All right. Nice meeting you too.
Yeah. So how do you pronounce your last name? Is it Kos or Kos?
Kos.
Kos. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
Yes.
Excellent.
It's short, but it's amazing how many people mispronounce it.
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah. So, well, is it Greek?
No, actually it's Czech, but there is an island off the coast of Greece that is called Kos.
That's probably why people think it's Kos.
Yeah, and it's spelled the exact same way. So
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I had to learn all of this when I got married.
Okay.
I took on the name and had to learn everything about it.
Excellent. Okay. Well, good. So good to see you. So I think this is the first one of these you've been to. Looks like, Asadur's here. Excellent. So this is the first one Asadur's been to as well. Hello, Asadur. How you doing? Can you hear us?
I hope he knows we can see him.
Oh,
Yeah.
There we go.
Oh, good.
I wasn't getting any volume.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Good. How you doing?
I'm good. How is
Good.
everybody doing tonight?
Good. Yeah. Now you're from Pittsburgh, right?
Philadelphia.
Oh, Philadelphia. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Just outside of Philly.
Yeah. All right. Excellent. Okay. And where are you from, Elizabeth?
I'm just outside Chicago.
Okay. So Philly, Chicago, and you're in Queens, Janine, is that right?
I'm in Queens, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
My wife's from Queens.
What was that?
My wife's from Queens.
Oh,
His
really?
wife is in Queens. Yeah.
What part? Do you know?
Like Bayside.
Oh, that's where I live.
Oh, there, you're probably down the street.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
She was on 210th Street back in the day.
Okay, we're on 200th Street.
10 blocks.
Yeah?
Anyway, so small world.
Yeah, it sure is.
So good. Well, good to see all you here. Maybe some others will come in later. I don't know. A few other people said they were going to try to make it. So that's fine. Whatever. So how are you all doing? Is there anything you want to talk about specifically?
You know, I'll be honest with you. The first thing I'm thinking about is trying to figure out what my term paper is going to be about.
Okay. Yeah. What do you have an idea what you might want to do?
Well, you know, I kind of want to incorporate, I don't know if this is what we can do, is like incorporate my Armenian right to scriptures and writing about that and how it's connected to the scriptures we're studying, you know, in this course. But that's just a thought. I mean, it may not be what you're looking for. But I'm just trying to get ideas of.
Oh. Okay, yeah. So I'm pretty wide open in terms of what the paper could be on, as long as it's related to the course in some way. You know, that sounds, it's fine to me with me.
Okay.
So you could do something more on the theology of Revelation, kind of shading it that way, or you could do something on the Bible itself. You know.
Right.
Or any of the figures we're profiling and that we've looked at in the course, or that's another possibility. You know, I suggested possibly doing book reviews also. That might be a way to do it. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, that was the one thing I was thinking is like, what can I write about? That's obviously interesting to me and would be interesting to everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's not bad ideas because the Armenian rite, I'm Catholic, so
yeah.
Armenian Catholic is just things a little different, So I wanted to kind of incorporate, the readings we do every Sunday, and
Okay.
we connect to those readings. Now, obviously, we don't do like Exodus and Genesis and things like
Right.
that, but I still want to utilize the New Testament we read from to connect it with the Old Testament we're studying also, and
Okay.
mesh it all together.
Sure. Sure.
So the only catch to it is a lot of the books, they're all in Armenian.
Oh, is that right?
I have to try and I'm going to translate them, but they're full of a lot of information.
Do you read Armenian?
I do.
Oh wow,
Yes.
fantastic.
Oh, that's
Yes.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yes, it's not an easy language. 36 letters, and if you ever have seen the Ethiopian language, the Ethiopians adopted the Armenian wording, so it's very similar.
How did that come to pass? Because they're not really that close to each other geographically.
Geographically or not, but there are a lot of Armenians in Ethiopia currently. Historically, a lot of the Armenians, were spread out. I don't know if you're aware, Armenia was the first country, shall we say, that adopted Christianity over 1700 years ago.
Right.
Spread everywhere after the king of Armenia at the time, renounced paganism,
Okay.
adopted Christianity.
Yeah.
We actually, St. Bartholomew, he was one of our patron saints, St. Thaddeus.
Right.
Major saints that they're our patron saints, shall we say.
Okay.
But yeah, there were a lot of Armenians went south into Africa, a lot went into Europe, not much in, towards Asia, but
Yeah. Now Armenia was what in sort of eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, that kind of area?
yes, northern Iran, actually in Iraq, yes.
Northern Iran, Iraq. Okay.
Historically, Armenia was about 3/4 of current Turkey.
Okay.
So we're obviously a lot smaller, World War I, World War II.
Right.
Stuff, but historically we were much larger. There was a big trade route between Armenia all the way to India, so there's a lot of Armenians in that path also. We were tradesmen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we kind of went everywhere, but yeah, the language itself, it is, I was amazed when I first learned about it. I'm like, this looks like our language, and Ethiopian language and Armenian,
Yeah.
very similar.
Now, what I've noticed, it seems like every Armenian has a name that ends in IAN, or
Yes.
either JIAN or SHIN, right? Or
It's primarily IAN or YAN.
YAN.
YAN is Armenians from Armenia, direct.
Okay.
IANs are every other Armenian outside the diaspora.
Oh, okay.
I don't know why they do it, but they do it.
Yeah.
I'm an IAN, but the IAN translated means son of. So we're
Okay. Okay.
something. Son of, like I'm Manassian, so I'm the son of Minas.
Okay. Okay.
So everybody has a history.
So you're Manassian, so son of Minas. Okay.
Right.
Got it. Okay.
Like my wife's maiden name was a long one, Vaskarijan.
Okay.
She was the son of a jeweler. Vaskarijan means jeweler in Armenian.
Okay. Okay.
So it doesn't necessarily mean you're attached to a name. It's just more of like maybe your family did this back in the day.
Right. Excellent.
You have a big history.
Good to know. Yeah. So most Armenians are in California, I think, aren't they? Is that?
There are a lot, and that's because a lot of the immigrants from Armenia.
Yeah.
We're taught there's about just Catholics. There's about 3,000 Catholics there.
Okay.
In our world, I mean, it may not be, maybe Roman Catholic, but in the Armenian Catholic world, that's tremendous.
Yeah.
Our cathedral is out there. Our eparchy is based there. Used to work in Los Angeles. So we're getting there.
Yeah.
We are a minority in the Armenian world. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Good. It looks like Marie is here also. Hi, Marie.
Hello.
How you doing? Where are you logging in from?
Utah.
Okay, excellent. Are you around Park City area?
I'm Well, if you consider that Salt Lake is near Park City.
Okay, you're in Salt Lake. Okay, good,
Yeah.
good. All right. Excellent. Well, fantastic. Well, welcome. So, so we were just talking a little bit about Asadur's term paper. So, did you have a question also on that too? I'm trying to remember.
I was thinking, actually, your suggestion about Dei Verbum and Verbum my Latin is terrible. Sorry.
Verbum Domini, yeah. So that would be the apostolic exhortation that Pope Benedict wrote.
Yes.
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit on salvation history in that document. The only problem is that there's not a whole lot of secondary literature on that document. So there's a little bit. Our own Father Bevel Bramwell wrote a commentary on it, which is available on Amazon, I think. And if you email him, he might actually even give you one. I don't know, but you can. He's in the CDU community, so frbramwell@cdu.edu.
I've taken 2 classes from him.
Yeah. So and there's some other ones as well. Dei Verbum is obviously a more important document because it's Vatican II. There's not that much on salvation history in Dei Verbum. There's a little bit, like in the very beginning, it's kind of hinted at. Someone else is doing this too, and I told them that I would make a copy of Joseph Ratzinger's, this is Pope Benedict before he was Pope Benedict, his commentary on Dei Verbum available too, for people who would like to read it. That's Dei Verbum 1 through 10.
Okay.
So that would be one that would be useful. But there, just to warn you, there's not a ton of stuff, secondary literature out there on that. So you would be kind of having to make something out of it yourself. But there is a book a collection of articles on a Verbum Domini that look kind of interesting, and it's called something to the effect of building the bridge between exegesis and theology. So that seemed to be an interesting book. I don't know if there's a lot of any articles on salvation history per se, but there are some interesting titles there. So someone else just asked me about this, so this information is fresh in my head. So
Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're very welcome. So so good. And Janine and Elizabeth, have you guys thought about your term paper at all?
I actually originally was looking at that Dei Verbum as well, but when I was looking for sources, I was having a problem. So
Yeah.
I looked for other things, and I actually spent most of today researching it. I think I'm going to do the Covenant of Noah and salvation history,
Okay.
which was
Sure.
there's a lot of information. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
And if you plug into the Bible Gateway, the Old Testament reading, you can also search for New Testament. So I can kind of relate it a little bit to salvation history.
Okay.
A basic fundamental.
Yeah.
In my notes, I think I asked you for a couple of New Testament,
Oh, okay.
additions that if I need some extra.
Oh, okay.
To
Sure.
go by.
Sure.
So I think I'm about 90%.
Okay.
sure that I'm
That sounds interesting. Yeah. And I think that's not something anyone's ever done before. So I'm excited to hear that. So,
Okay, great.
Yeah. And good. And Elizabeth, did you have an idea what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I've actually been working with a librarian, and I think I've kind of narrowed it down because I had too broad of a topic at first. I was trying to focus on Mary as the new Eve.
Oh, okay.
And-
That's right. Yeah.
And then we've kind of focused it into being more with the ante-Nicene fathers, kind of their take and the kind of the original thought of
Sure.
Mary is the new Eve.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that is something that does come up in Irenaeus and Justin Martyr, I believe. So, and
Yes, yeah.
they do see. I think is it Irenaeus? I think it's Irenaeus that sees. It might be Justin or Irenaeus. It's one of the two of them that sees the Annunciation when the angel Gabriel appears to Mary as a recapitulation of the serpent talking to Eve. So it's
Yes.
kind of a neat interpretation.
Yes, it's interesting how he says they both get visited by an angel.
Yeah.
And it, like one's fallen, one's-
Exactly.
Yeah, so
Exactly.
it's been kind of interesting looking at
Yeah.
that.
Do you know what Pope Francis's interpretation is? I just heard that.
No.
So you know how the gospel, the angel Gabriel announcing to Mary is considered like the gospel proclamation because he's proclaiming the coming of the kingdom. So he's pronouncing the good news, and the serpent announcing to Eve what to do is fake news.
Oh, I like that. Maybe I'll change to focus on
yeah.
that. That's what-
So yeah, just Google it. He did a speech on that, which I thought was pretty amusing. I don't think he was trying to be funny, but I thought it was funny.
Oh, that is funny. Yeah, I was actually looking at Tertullian actually has a lot of information on that as well. But I'm trying not to get caught up in the later Tertullian where I could get myself into some theological trouble. So
Right. That's okay. Yeah. Yeah. So that would be good. That sounds like a good paper topic. So, excellent. And good. I see Francis is here. Hi, Francis.
Hi.
Good to see you. So we've got a couple new people. Elizabeth Koss is here. Asadur is here. And I'm sorry, Maria, I forget your last name. What's your last name?
Michelle.
Oh, Michelle, that's right. Okay, good. And Marie Michel's here also. So good to see you. We were talking about term papers. So did you have an idea of what you wanted to do yet?
I'm still working on it. I think
Okay, that's fine.
narrowed down the list. But I had a question about the bibliography that we have to turn in. How many sources are you looking for us to list in our bibliography?
I'm not so much looking for a number of sources as long as the sources are kind of like appropriate for the topic that you want to do, as opposed to just sort of random books that are pulled off a shelf, which happens sometimes. People have like, I got the Catechism here. I got, this Alphonsus Liguori. I got, this thing by Joseph Ratzinger. So these will be my three sources. And yeah, so that happens a lot. So yeah. So if you find sources that are appropriate to your topic, that's more important than having a certain number of them. But usually for a good term paper, 5 to 7 is a pretty good number. It could be more or less, but I'm certainly not going to count them. But remember also that reference works don't count as sources, although you're certainly encouraged to consult them. Like the Catechism is a reference work, so it doesn't count as a source. What could count as a source are the sources that are in the bottom of the Catechism, where they talk about the sources where the teaching actually comes from. It gives you the reference to chase that down. That's where you need to pay your attention, because that's where the thing that they're citing is taken from. So that gives you a sort of a lead to look for. And likewise, if you're consulting an encyclopedia like the Anchor Bible Dictionary, that wouldn't count as a source either, but nevertheless, it's good information to kind of get you started. And also the real value is to see what are some sources that you should be consulting to write more on this, because that will show you what the person that wrote the article consulted. So it gives you kind of a sense of what's out there. So that's often a very good way to start a paper, is by consulting reference works and using those as sources. So and likewise, the Bible is not a source, but obviously you consult the Bible too, right? So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Very good. So that's a pretty good turnout. So it looks like we've got 5-6 people here. This is great. This is I think the most we've ever had. So, well, certainly tied for the most. So, so good. So anyway, what do you guys want to talk about? Do you want to talk about anything in the lesson this week or last week or coming up, or just general things? Or I kind of leave this open for you guys to take the lead. And I try to not do most of the talking. So if you want to ask questions.
Well, I commented on this with Janine's comment too, because one of the things in my reading that I was just struck, especially the way we read it, was how much whining there was by the people during the Exodus. And
right,
I mentioned this. was also really surprised by when reading it straight through how much Moses seemed to be counseling God almost, which seemed it just didn't seem right. It just didn't sit right as I was reading it.
Right. Yeah. So are you talking about when God was going to destroy the people after the golden calf, and then Moses kind of had to talk him down?
Exactly. Yeah.
So right. That's those are some kind of famous scenes there where God's I can't really decide. Should I destroy the people or should I free them and give them another chance? Moses, help me out. So one way to interpret that is to say it's of course not God who's really uncertain. It's Moses who's uncertain, and that the whole story is designed to kind of elicit Moses in his being an intercessor. And so, one of the trigger moments that comes out of that whole exchange is Moses's, willingness to kind of lay down his life and say, look, you can just take me. Okay. Take me and save the people. And that's one of the things that is in the story to kind of get God to turn around. So, but there's no question that the exchanges between God and Moses are very anthropomorphic, and that they really make God, seem kind of human. And so, that's always been an interesting puzzle for the tradition to kind of work out. There's obviously a lot of paradoxes and puzzles in that. God will sometimes repent of things, like he'll sometimes change his mind. He can be persuaded not to do things if there's something that happens. So what do we make of this, like metaphysically, right? So this is sort of a little bit of a puzzle for interpretation, because there's often in later church history, kind of a metaphysical correction of these things. Like, well, it's not really so much that God can change. It's more like repentance is sort of an analogy of what we see God doing based on, an analogy of how a human being would act in a similar, circumstance. So, but it is fascinating. You're right. And a lot of times people, take for granted, an image of God that you have, that sometimes is a little bit different than what you see when you look at the text. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
It's There's probably a little bit of humor involved in it too, I think, in some ways. I find the story sort of humorous in some ways too.
With the constant whining, they're always, why did you take us out of Egypt?
Right.
Why did you bring us here?
Yeah, they sound like children.
One of those signs, we'd be happy.
Yeah, right. Exactly. We had it so good in Egypt. We had cucumbers. We had, wonderful
yeah, we had cucumbers.
yeah. Right. Exactly. And then you see in Psalm 95, if you pray the office, 40 years I endured that generation, and they do not know my ways. Okay, but I said, and I swore to them in my anger, they shall not know my rest. Right. So yeah, and that's sort of the spiritual takeaway of all this. Like, we all have a choice of sort of being like the wilderness generation, because there's all a certain way in which we're in a wilderness right now, right? We've sort of been pulled out of Egypt, so we're not in Egypt anymore, but we're also not in the promised land either. So we're sort of in this intermediate stage in this life, and that's a test for us, whether we secretly long to return to Egypt, or whether we're willing to stay in the desert and remain faithful for the time that it takes. So you can see that that's exactly the interpretation of the story that the Hebrews writer takes in, like, Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, when he sort of compares the Christian life today in the age of the church with the experience of the wilderness generation, arguing that what happened to the wilderness generation is just, sort of a down payment of what will happen to the people of God now if they follow the example of the wilderness generation. So yeah, It's really interesting all that the Hebrews writer makes of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So excellent. So what else?
Yeah, it's good reading, especially through like all the plagues. It was really unbelievable to me that they had to have so much and endured so much, and they still, Pharaoh wasn't changing his mind, and then
Right.
change his mind and tease them, and then turn around and come back. Like you just couldn't stop reading it. It was really
Right. It is a good story. It is.
It's great.
Yeah.
It was
It's
really good.
it is a fun story to read.
But it's also cool to connect it with the New Testament too, to go back and
Right, exactly.
find things, which I was trying to do. I think it would have been easier if I read the notes first to get some clues, because I was drawing at some straws, like just on my own, like thinking of my own ideas, like with the tent and the tabernacle,
Yeah.
and the blood, and the bread of, the Eucharist living in the tabernacle, and then, Jesus living in us.
Yeah.
I was trying to connect everything. And then I think if I would have gone through the notes first, I wasn't so far off on a few things.
Right.
But
Right.
it would have been a little bit easier to answer the discussion question. I just went off my Bible readings and my own notes that I was making before I read yours.
Yeah. Well, the Exodus is a good story to catechize with, because there's really a little bit of everything, and the sort of analogy of that story, with sort of life of the church and all the aspects of life of the church is, they fit together pretty neatly, like the crossing of the Red Sea and baptism, the wilderness, and corresponds to life after baptism, the need to remain faithful through testing and temptation, corresponds to, maybe to some extent life in general, like sort of an idealistic interpretation of Israel. If you're to say, like, where am I in the story? That might be where you are. Pharaoh, the hardening of his heart, hardening his own heart. The paradox also that God hardens his heart too. Like, how do we make sense of that? That's kind of an interesting one too. The plagues. The plagues actually come up in several ways in the New Testament. One, the Revelations, if you study the book of Revelations closely, you'll see that the plagues in the vision of Revelations are sort of analogous to the plagues that happen in Egypt. And so there's clearly there's only so much we can look at in this book, but that's there if you want to look at it. And really sort of understanding this sort of two things, right? The testing that we're undergoing also, and the plagues that are sort of falling down at the same time, because there's in Revelations this sense of this great sort of final test that's happening, in which the people of God, have to remain faithful through it, but which, but which their fidelity and their worship, sort of determines the fate of history. So it's a very exciting book to sort of read in light of the Exodus, as well as a lot of other things in the Old Testament. Yeah. So and then of course crossing the Jordan also has the analogy of the next world, or heaven, or the new heavens and the new earth. Promised land, so that that's there too. And there's obviously a did we talk about this week? I think maybe we'll talk about this next week a little bit. Maybe I won't get too far ahead, but the connection between Joshua and Jesus. So we'll talk about that next week. But the name Joshua in Greek is Jesus, so it is the same name. So there clearly is a connection between those two figures as well, both in terms of the typology and also just in terms of like a foreshadowing. So, yeah, we'll talk.
You don't get all that. You don't get all that off your first read.
No. So and we'll. I think we'll talk about that next week when we get into the Deuteronomistic history a little bit more. And the curse. I think we get into Deuteronomy next week. So, and the DH, so-called the Deuteronomistic history, which is Joshua all the way through Second Kings. Those books of the Bible without Ruth. So yeah. So good. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it. So so having you read it in light of Hebrews is a little bit more of a challenge. So I figured some of you would be at least somewhat familiar with the Exodus story before. I mean, you probably have seen, at least seen some of the movies and stuff, and, and if not read the stories or some version of them. So most people know the stories a little bit, but what's interesting is all the ways in which they figure in theologically, in terms of later tradition. So, for instance, this idea of the beatific vision, the idea of looking at God in the face, that Paul talks about a little bit in 2 Corinthians 4 and 5, is based on Moses and his ascent up the mountain and seeing God in the face. That's Moses is sort of the archetype of that. That what Moses had then, Moses was uniquely privileged to get in the Old Testament. No one else had it, but that will be something open to everybody in the next world. So, so you've heard of the beatific vision. This is sort of another way of understanding that in light of the Bible.
I had a basic question just going through the notes of, I'm having trouble separating out the feasts. The Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the Feast of the Pentecost, and the Feast of the Tabernacles. I'm mixing them up.
Yeah. So which would the unleavened bread be? That's
a great question.
that's a springtime feast. So that's Passover.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's Passover. Okay.
Right. Okay, and then Tabernacles is kind of a fall feast. That would actually Tabernacles is a little bit later than it's more of a late spring, early summer feast. So that would correspond roughly to Pentecost.
Okay.
So Passover corresponds sort of to Easter, Tabernacles to Pentecost, and then what was the third one you mentioned?
The Feast of Pentecost.
Feast of Pentecost, yeah. So right, so you see some Old Testament analogies in both of those. So Pentecost is one word, the Greek term for the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, which is the way it comes out in Hebrew.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay. I think that's probably where my confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So go ahead.
No, I was going to let her finish. Sorry.
Okay.
This is Marie. I just had a question too. We skipped all the way over Joseph. Does he not figure into salvation history?
Well, that's the thing. So he does. It's just that there's a lot on Joseph, and there's I can only give you so much reading in an 8-week course, and so if we had like a whole year-length course, we could spend a lot of time kind of working through the Joseph cycle. But that's sort of one of the and I acknowledge that at the beginning of the course, this is sort of also one of the weaknesses of the salvation history reading. Like Joseph obviously doesn't fit in as neatly into salvation history. He's a little bit of a digression in some ways from, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and those 3 cycles. Obviously, Joseph is important because without Joseph, the people never get to Egypt to begin with, so there's no Exodus. But the thing about the book of Genesis is that salvation history almost by definition has to focus a lot more on Abraham, because that's, for salvation history, at least as Paul does it, he's the central figure. Whereas the book of Genesis, though, there's a lot more written on Joseph. The Joseph cycle is a lot longer than the Abraham cycle is. So what do you say? I mean, it is a little bit of a weakness in our approach that we're giving sort of more attention to certain aspects of the story than others. and I plead guilty to that weakness, because that is I think a valid criticism of what we're doing. But on the other hand, we are sort of following what Paul does. Paul never actually mentions, to my knowledge, never mentions Joseph, but he does mention Abraham a great deal. So Abraham's obviously very important to his understanding of the Old Testament. And his understanding of the Old Testament, I think I mentioned this last week, is kind of the one we're following for the whole course. I mean, we're talking this week about Hebrews because, he makes an awful lot of the Exodus story, Moses in his ascent in Sinai, and the wilderness generation afterwards. So the Hebrews writer does an awful lot with that story, and so we're sort of spending a little bit of time with that. But for most of the rest of the course, we're actually going to be focusing on Paul, and in particular, Paul's interpretation of salvation history, and really the sort of interplay between the promise of Abraham and the Deuteronomic law, and how those sort of clash in history. And we'll sort of start with that story next week.
Okay, so I think as you said, the importance of Joseph is that's how the people get to Egypt. I mean, you could.
Yeah, exactly. Sure,
You
that's
could probably draw more out if you were really looking, but that's
sure, exactly.
primary.
Exactly, and
Okay.
if we have more time, there's some people have drawn some typological connection between Joseph, brothers, and aspects of the New Testament story. There's that. There definitely is a connection between Joseph, the dreamer, and who's the figure who first has dreams in the Gospel of Matthew.
Isn't it Joseph?
It's Joseph, yes, and that's not a coincidence. Okay, there is a definite play on the story of Joseph having his dreams, and Joseph, the old Joseph, also being a dreamer, having very important dreams, dreams that ultimately lead to the rescuing of his people, and the same thing true with the second Joseph having dreams as well. So there's clearly a connection there. Joseph is also very different than the other patriarchs. In some ways, he's really not even a patriarch at all. Like, you read the book of Genesis, it's always the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's never once mentioned as the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, right? So there's something that happens after Jacob that we sort of end the patriarchal period, and the pattern of the patriarchs is broken. So God never actually speaks to Joseph directly, whereas he speaks frequently to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He never once addresses Joseph directly, although he's obviously intervening frequently in his life. He never speaks to him openly the way he does to Abraham or to Isaac or to Jacob, repeating the basic promises. So that's unique. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, like good patrilineal tribal chieftains, have to take a bride from within their own family, right? So you never marry outside the extended family in that part of the world. That's why, the servant has to be sent back to Orpha in northern Turkey, or Ur of the Chaldees, to procure a bride for Isaac. And it's also why Jacob has to go back and find his wife Rachel, right? He has to go back to the original ancestral home of his father. He can't marry someone among the Canaanites. That's taboo. But who did Joseph marry? Do you remember?
I don't.
Asenath. So Asenath is an Egyptian woman. So he breaks the pattern as well. So he is different in that he marries differently. His family structure is different. Most of his career takes place outside of Canaan, whereas the most important part of the career of the patriarchs takes place within Canaan. Yahweh never talks to Joseph directly, so those are some differences as well. So these are some kind of literary aspects of the story that are important, both within the story itself and that story as a foreshadowing of Joseph in the New Testament, for which there clearly is a typological connection of sorts. So we could have spent time on this, but there's only so much I can load you down with in terms of content. So
Right, but it sounds as though it would be more of a digression than the straight line that we're on.
Yeah, a little bit. That's right. Hey, Rick's here. Are you from the Philippines? Calling from the Philippines, Rick?
Doctor.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm in New York.
Oh, you're in New York. Excellent. Excellent. Well, good. Good to see you.
Call, so catching up.
Okay,
Good to
good.
see you too.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining. So we were just talking about Joseph in the Old Testament, in Genesis. So, there's one other thing I could point out about Joseph in Genesis 50. There is a prophecy. Joseph gives a kind of a final prophecy, and there seems to be a little bit of relevance for salvation history in that, although it's a little bit more difficult to tease out, right? When he gives the prophecy over, actually it's Jacob who gives the prophecy to all of them. Joseph's sort of the leader at that point, and so there's a some would see a little bit of salvation history in that, but it's a little bit difficult to tease out, I think, and so we didn't spend a whole lot of time with it. As I was telling the others, Rick, we're sort of focusing mostly this. If we had to sort of name a patron saint of our course, it's St. Paul, because we're sort of following about 3/4 of the course is really designed kind of roughly on Paul's interpretation of, as I see it, of the Old Testament story. And although this week we're not really doing much of Paul, we're doing the letter to the Hebrews, which uses the Exodus story in a very different kind of a way than Paul did. There's some overlap, but there's also a lot of differences.
I'm going to add a little humor.
Are we bringing in, the last time we brought in the Saint Irenaeus and some of the fathers?
So Irenaeus is kind of someone that we're looking at as well. So he's someone who has that theory of recapitulation, which is kind of useful in a lot of ways. And we looked at the fathers as well. So that's kind of a part of the early part of the course as well. So but starting next week, it's going to be mostly Paul and Luke too. So we'll do a little Luke in the last couple of weeks. So, yeah. So someone else is going to say something?
Yeah, it was me. I was going to add some humor to this conversation.
Yeah.
So, I'm reading Genesis, Exodus. Everybody seems to be over 100 years old. How is that possible?
Well, really good diet, exercise.
It just seems kind of
smoking.
interesting.
Then there's yeah.
I'm just fascinated. Like, is this a cryptic kind of number that you're giving us? Something? Is it based on the before Common Era kind of thing? I don't.
No. Yeah. So one answer that I think we could give is that most of like the really really old patriarchs are living before the flood, like to that age. And so there is a sense in which the flood kind of did change some things, and that the world was different before than after. For instance, if you look closely at the story before the flood, it doesn't seem that people are eating any meat yet. Okay, I'm not saying that eating meat is wrong or anything, or that it's not healthy to eat meat, but the first explicit permission to eat meat comes, after the flood. And so, and when God told, Adam to eat, he didn't tell him to eat animals. He told him to eat whatever he found in the garden. So presumably that's a vegetarian diet. So maybe it's a vegetarian thing. I don't know. Maybe, yeah. So maybe before the flood, just people aged a lot more slowly. Maybe the ages of the patriarchs has kind of a symbolic value. That's another sort of possible interpretation we could take. Obviously, if we kind of have talked about the history before, especially in Genesis 1 through 11, is going to have a very sort of different feel to it than afterwards. And we probably not necessarily. I mean, they could be literal, right? But by the same token, there's a lot of sort of figurative stuff happening in the first 11 chapters. So I certainly, wouldn't require somebody to believe that the patriarchs literally aged to thousands of years old. But who knows? I mean.
I just thought it was something symbolic.
Yeah,
identifying him as elder.
Right, exactly. It could be symbolic. I'm trying to think if there's some other theories about this, right? Obviously, maybe that might be one reason that God had the flood too, is to sort of finally put to death all the people that were living too long in the old world and kind of start anew, and allow death a more freer reign at that point to kill people sooner. That's certainly a possibility as well. I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that one.
No problem.
Yeah.
No problem. Just a thought there.
Yeah, exactly. They had good health care too, I think. Yeah.
I guess so. I guess, the international health.
All the insurance covered pre-existing conditions and low and.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, what was considered a year? Like, what calendar were they using? Maybe a year isn't a year what we think. So 100 years.
Exactly. Although presumably back then that the Earth took the same period of time to go around the sun. So, but yeah, who knows? Maybe the Earth moves more slowly then. Maybe everything just kind of moved more slowly. Yeah. Kind of like in that one episode of Star Trek where people get accelerated and they kind of move so fast they kind of sound like little buzzing flies and stuff. Yeah, maybe that's the way we are now. Maybe back then it was just really moving slowly and stuff. But they could enjoy the world more, so they could, because they weren't so busy and moving speedily. I don't know. Oh, good question.
I've never noticed this before, but in Exodus 16, where it says they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin.
A scene, yeah. It's just the name of a place. It's not literally the Sin wilderness. Yeah.
I know, but I was laughing because I was like,
Yeah,
no, it kind of is the wilderness of Sin.
Right.
Well, that's a pretty good.
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of like the translation.
Yeah. The wilderness of Sin. That's right.
I don't think I ever knew that's how it was spelled.
Yeah. So there's some funny things that come out in like the Bible if you read it in the original language. Like in the Hebrew version, if you look at one of the Exodus, the plague of frogs, in the first time it's mentioned, there's actually one frog, so it's literally the plague of frog. So there was one rabbi who thought that in the plague of frog there was one giant frog, and that was what got unleashed. And then Moses hit his staff, and that one frog turned into millions of little ones. So no, because it says frog and then it says frogs for no reason, just says that. So there's just kind of weird things like that people think are significant, but they're probably not. So that would be kind of cool though, having a giant frog though.
That would be cool.
Not if you're in front of it.
So yeah. Great. So, excellent. So, have you guys had a chance to look at Hebrews yet, much or no?
Yeah, I've already posted my
Start
comments.
reading.
Okay.
But I haven't
I have not had a
started
chance
it.
to look at it myself quite yet. You were saying, Rick? You were saying something?
Did we lose him?
Yeah, it was my assigned reading in the previous week, so I've read it.
Oh, good,
But
okay.
I need to still relate it to the.
Okay, yeah, good. So there's a lot of typology between Hebrews and Exodus, but there's also a lot of just interpretation of covenant and covenant fulfillment and that kind of thing. So, and you know, in particular, a real sort of wrestling with the issue of the New Testament vis-a-vis the Old Law, and you know, how Christ fits into this. So the key idea to the Hebrews writer's interpretation of Christ is this idea that, you know, when you combine Psalm 2, or really, I guess, Psalm 8 and Psalm 110, and really draws out the idea in Psalm 110 of Christ being the high priest. And that really is something he kind of takes the ball and runs with throughout the whole book. The drawing out of the significance of interpreting Jesus as the high priest, superior to the high priest of Moses, with a better priestly offering, with a better tabernacle, with a better sanctuary, but always sort of understanding Christ as being a perfection and something to which the old pointed to, but never could quite realize. So it really brings Jesus Christ in a whole new light. I think that idea of the high priest, Jesus as the high priest.
Yeah, that was my
role?
reading.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Was Aaron also a high priest?
Yeah, right. So Aaron was sort of the initial high priest, Moses' older brother. And you know, the whole argument is that the high priesthood of Christ is superior to the high priesthood of Aaron, right? And so, yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
So yeah. So it's a pretty complicated argument though, and so I kind of tried to tease it out a little bit and to help show you some new things in it, which will hopefully deepen, you know, your own understanding of reading the Old Testament, reading the Old Testament in light of the New, and the way, kind of seeing the way the Hebrews writer does it.
I like seeing him puzzle out the
Hebrews,
being the mediator and being God.
The mediator.
Yeah, I like seeing him puzzle out that Christ is both the mediator and God.
Right.
The mediator to God and God at the same time. That was right. I like the way he puzzled it out.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. What were you saying, Rick? I'm sorry.
Well, in the opening, right at the start of Hebrews, it mentions many and various ways God spoke of old to our fathers.
Yeah.
And of course, I mentioned Christ in verse 2.
Yes, and that's very salvation historical. That presupposes
one key. Yes. Now that actually brings to mind something that some really stark difference between the God of the Old Testament, which is, you know, comes across as very, well, judgmental and even sometimes harsh, and of course you see that in the plagues, and Jesus Christ, who preaches mercy and really in a less stark way already juxtaposes it in the first two verses. And the question comes to mind is how you actually reconcile those two aspects of God, which are both God. And of course, over the ages, various spiritual thinkers have grappled with that. And I guess that's one thing that I might look at in particular, especially in light of Exodus and a God that inflicts 10 plagues on the Egyptians. No? Yeah.
Yeah. So, but that's sort of the question: is God wrathful in the Old Testament and merciful in the New? I think you come up with some arguments for that, but I think you come up with a lot of other contrary arguments too. I mean, like, are there some examples in what we read this week of mercy being shown in the Old Testament?
He does show mercy because when Moses asks for, intercedes on their behalf,
Yeah.
is okay. Sure.
That would be a perfect example of mercy being shown in the Old Testament at a time when God sort of wanted, the idea is he wanted to destroy Israel, but he didn't. And so there were two arguments Moses gave, actually. The first argument was, okay, you can take me. So there's an intercessory argument. And then the sort of second argument, once it gets heated up again in the second round of the story, the second argument is, wait, you can't do this, God, because why? Remember your covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? So if you kill these people, you will have failed in your covenant because you had to use them because of your covenant to bless the rest of the nation. So you will have failed in your covenant obligation. But you're right, though. Mercy is shown in that example. And I would say in the Hebrews that we read this week, there's plenty of times where anger is threatened. I mean, not just reflected on the past, but threatened as a present reality for people who continue to disobey, right? I mean, so that's something to kind of ponder, right? There's a lot of times where wrath is threatened in the New Testament and mercy is shown in the Old Testament. So I mean, I would kind of see it both in both ways, right? What do you think, Rick? Do you agree with me?
I would say that in certain instances, as you mentioned, especially toward the Israelites, there is mercy and understanding.
Yeah.
The people who raise this aspect of God, well, go all the way back to Adam and Noah, where you have the flood and of course all of humanity, apple eaten. No, so I mean, I don't want to get into that, but this comes up in those who raise it.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Well, good. So what else?
There was also some plagues in Numbers. Also, when I started reading Numbers, I saw that there was some reference to plagues.
Yeah.
Which I didn't write down
my
question to it. I was just I don't know if one references the other, where he had said in the Old Testament, sometimes one of the authors will reference another author in the Old Testament. Is this an example of that, or just?
So sometimes that's right. So most interpreters think that part of Numbers and part of Exodus have the same author, and then another part of Numbers and another part of Exodus have the same author. So, but nevertheless, there definitely is a lot of continuity between the two stories. And you do see things happening a second time. So if you really read the story carefully, you'll notice that sometimes things repeat themselves a little bit. Mm-hmm. Like for instance, you remember when people are complaining, which is it? They're complaining in Numbers that they want meat, right? And but if you notice in Exodus, there's a story where they've actually been eating meat from the beginning. So it's there's a little bit of inconsistency there, but but the number story is a really interesting story in a lot of ways. And we didn't discuss like the Balaam story with the talking donkey. That's a fun story as well. But I don't know if I had to or not, but so. But St. Thomas Aquinas looked at Numbers and saw, kind of a prefigurement for some of the feasts, like the Pentecost feast, the Tabernacles. Definitely a preparation for the Pentecost and the New Testament. There's clearly a connection between the Passover and the Old and the Easter celebration of the New. So. That's there as well. So as Janine pointed out, there's sort of a whole series of cycles of disobedience and punishment in of rebellion and punishment in Numbers, dealing with different issues. the people grumbling, the people murmuring, depending on your translation. So there's a series of cycles they go through with that.
Is there a theology of punishment?
Of punishment? Oh, sure, yeah. So the whole book's written on it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. It's a good question. I mean, I'll tell you what. Let me hold off on giving you a more thorough answer once we get into Deuteronomy next week, because just to kind of prepare you for what we'll see next week. So there's sort of two covenants in the Sinai generation, right? So the one would be the one that is done in Exodus 20 through 24, and that's where Moses goes up to the mountain and receives the law, and then there's a covenant ceremony when he gets down and the people promise to obey the covenant, and then they don't, and then we go through the golden calf story in Exodus 32, 33, and 34, and then God spares the people. But then in Deuteronomy, you sort of see a version that takes place much later in Moses' career, where people are getting closer to entering the promised land, and there's a second covenant sworn. This time, God is not nearly as close to Israel as he is at Sinai. There's no great fanfare. The legislation is a little bit different. The Ten Commandments are given again, but in a slightly different form. But what's more significant about that one is that there's a series of promises that God basically forces Israel to swear, okay? And there are going to be rewards for obedience and punishments for disobedience. And the punishments are going to, like the rewards, are going to fall upon the entire people. And so the story after the book of Deuteronomy, after that Deuteronomic covenant is sworn, is the whole Deuteronomic covenant and the curses that it brings playing themselves out in history, and having the people sort of never really succeeding. You have like a situation where you think the people achieve eventually a kingdom and the promises of Abraham, and yet it's like going one step forward and two steps back, because eventually there's a rebellion, the kingdom falls apart. Eventually the rebellion falls apart and half the kingdom is destroyed, and then the Davidic kingdom finally is destroyed in 587 BC, and the temple is destroyed, and the people are driven into exile. And so there's this kind of constant spiritual descent all throughout the story of Israel, from pretty much Joshua on down through 2 Kings. It's called the Deuteronomistic history because all the themes that really announced in Deuteronomy kind of play out through the life of the people afterwards. And what we'll see in Deuteronomy when we look at it closely is to see that basically what Moses sees at that point in Deuteronomy is that he sees that the people really will not obey the covenant, and he knows that they won't, and he knows ultimately for that reason that the punishments that Deuteronomy predicts will have to happen. Okay. And so this sort of sets up the great, theological problem that Paul will eventually solve. How can God bless all of the nations through Abraham and Israel when the same people is now under this curse of Deuteronomy, in which exile, destruction, and death, are the inevitable results? There's a basic contradiction in the story that sort of has to be worked out. So there's sort of this tension within the story, and that's the thing that Paul will resolve. But before we see Paul's resolution, we kind of have to set up the whole problem, and that's kind of what we'll look at next week in more detail. So the great sort of problem of Deuteronomy. And so Rick is asking about the theology of punishment. The theology of punishment in Deuteronomy is not instantaneous punishment for wrongdoing. It's more like kind of a slow-acting poison. So the one generation will break the law, but the consequences follow sometimes years and years and many generations later. So it's kind of this sort of Damocles. You know, eventually the sword's going to fall, but you never know when that's going to be. But you know that it will eventually. And when it does fall, you'll know exactly why it fell. And then at that point, the only thing you can do is ask God to please, you know we deserve what's happened to us, but please, nevertheless, you did promise us these blessings through Abraham. Can you please deliver on it? We know why you haven't, but please will you? So this is kind of what we're going to see as the story works its way through the story of beginning with Joshua through Judges. Ruth is not really part of it, so Ruth is a different kind of literature, but gets thrown in because Ruth is sort of related to David, so it's kind of a side story. But then going all the way to 2 Kings and the eventual dismemberment and falling apart of the Davidic kingdom. So in the theology of Deuteronomy, punishment is long-lasting and multi-generational, and might happen generations after the incident takes place. Yes.
Yeah. Picking up on the points you made, it does seem, of course, that God still punishes and still exacts certain conditions, despite what we and in Abraham, where he actually gave a promise that did not require any condition of Abraham.
Yeah.
So there are still conditions.
Right.
And failing to follow the law has its consequences.
Right.
You call it punishment, call it consequences. Second thing is that in the context of salvation history, one thought that comes putting any malice to it, and so that they and God had to be the one to fix it because man has been shown to be a failure.
Right,
even
exactly.
the chosen people fail. So
Exactly.
I mean,
and we'll see, like you said there, that there's two different kinds of covenants. The Abraham covenant's
looking
going
at
to be
it in
one
a
kind of
malicious
covenant.
way on the part of God.
Yeah. That the Abraham covenant's going to be one kind of covenant. The Deuteronomy covenant's going to be a different kind of
Yeah,
covenant.
I think when we said to Abraham that it was a covenant that didn't, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. So your internet's a tad slow there, Rick. I think we're having a little trouble hearing you, and I think you might be having trouble hearing me too.
It's just a bit slow. I'm going to switch off my video. It might help.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So
and-
yeah,
So at any rate, I don't really want to keep you too much longer. We've been at this a little over an hour, so do you? I'm happy to stay a little bit
Yeah.
longer. But do you guys want to ask me anything else
Yeah.
before we wind down? Or
I had a question actually about the quiz, but maybe I can just email you to that.
oh, okay,
after.
that's
Yeah.
fine. You can email it to me, no problem. I haven't graded the quizzes yet, so hopefully I'll get those next couple days. All right.
Thank you.
Well,
Okay.
but the question
Thank
that
you.
I had was in the automatic part of the quiz. Which
Okay.
was,
Okay. Good enough.
anyway, I'll email you.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.
night.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.